Remember, she's not a girl.
I'm a shark.
I want to cap off my video this week with a look at Adaptation. Partly having to do with this is Banned Book Week, if you weren't already aware. And while I'm not particularly certain if the book we're going to be talking about and the adaptation subsequent to it has actually been banned in the past, it might only just be because it's themes that would get it banned in places like Florida are a little below the surface. I've already talked about the film Nimona. In fact, I dedicated a whole video on why that movie is absolutely phenomenal. But I want to go a layer deeper, and I want to talk about how good it is as an adaptation. And this one, I'm really excited to talk about, because I've talked about adaptations intermittently. I talked about the Watchmen adaptation a while back and how excessive loyalty to the source material actually hurt the story. I've talked about the adaptation of Neil Gaiman's Sandman and how it is incredibly loyal to the source material, but makes a number of incredibly smart changes selectively. Nimona is an even more unique case, I think, because it is, in my mind, without a doubt, a masterful adaptation that deviates heavily when it comes to story and plot. And even some of the characters are quite different, but regardless, it is such a good adaptation of the heart of the original work. Now, a couple things before I get into this. This is not going to be a blow-by-blow list of the differences between the original graphic novel and the movie. That's not what I'm here to do. There are other YouTubers who do that. Hint, hint, Dominic Noble, please do a Lost in adaptation of Nimona if it's not already on your docket. But that's not what I'm doing. I'm not going blow for blow and telling you what every difference is. I will be highlighting differences, but only as a way to talk about the way they were changed and why these were smart adaptational changes.
That explains literally nothing.
Now, this does mean that by necessity, I'm going to be spoiling the movie and the book. This book is real good. And even if you've seen the movie, you really should read this, because it is quite different. Let's talk a little bit about what this book is, and then get into the adaptations and how it's smart. Nimona was the first published work by N.D. Stevenson, also goes by Nate Stevenson. Now, Nate Stevenson, at a quite young age, started doing Nimona as a webcomic and finished the story. It got compiled and released as a graphic novel. Now, its history as a webcomic already leads to some interesting quirks, such as the continued improvement of the art style. When he first started, the art style was fairly simplistic, but you can see as it goes, it gets more sophisticated, especially the coloring of it. And that's really fascinating to watch. And in a way, it kind of enhances the story as you get to know these characters deeper, as the story honestly gets a bit more serious as opposed to its lighter tone at the front end. My initial guess was, in fact, that was done on purpose. I found out later it was just a happy accident because he was getting more confident in his art abilities as he continued this story. But you read it all compiled and it just starts out, while very clearly still being in the same style, but starts out a bit more rough, a bit looser, and then just gets more sophisticated, more streamlined. It kind of suits the story in an odd way. And the other thing that is really important, and we're going to circle back onto this and highlight it, while he was not fully aware of the exact direction of where his journey was going to take him, Nate Stevenson was working through a fair bit of gender-related things as he worked on this, because Nate Stevenson is a trans-masculine individual, and he didn't have that fully sorted by the time Nimona was done and published.
I didn't know what I was doing when I first started drawing comics over a decade ago. I just knew that my emotions were too big for my body and I had to put them somewhere. From these feelings, a character began to emerge. I named her Nimona for no particular reason. It just felt right. I didn't think I deserved love, but maybe she did.
To look at this, he was very clearly working through some things, or at least starting to. So that is very much present in the work, and we're going to get into that a little bit more. But broadly speaking, I'm kind of assuming that you know at least the movie, if not both, as I move forward. But broad overview, in a kingdom that is a mix of fantasy and largely present-day technology, like there's smartphones and you can get pizza delivered, but also there's knights fighting with lances and things like that, there is a figure called Ballister. In the book, he is named Ballister Blackheart. In the movie, he was renamed to Ballister Boldheart in kind of an overhaul of his character. We'll get into that. He is finding himself in the position of villain within the kingdom. And he is at odds with what is referred to as the Institute. And someone finds him, this shapeshifter named Nimona, who just wants to be his sidekick in his villainous schemes. Except Nimona, in addition to her shapeshifting powers, is far more intense in terms of how hard she wants to do this, how far she wants to take the villainy, how destructive she wants to be. He's way more subdued than she is, but they bond and they fight the Institute. And there is history between Ballister and Ambrosius Goldenloin, who were both friends and somewhat rivals at an earlier point in their lives. But there came a point where, in order to secure his own position, his own future, Ambrosius did something that cost Ballister his arm. And they've been rivals ever since. You have the director of the Institute, who's sort of an overhanging villain, but there's also just the general sense from Nimona of rejection. The sense that she sought out Ballister because who besides a villain was ever going to accept her? Was ever going to want to do anything with her, much less do things in the neighborhood of the kind of stuff she wants to do, like destruction. Now, the movie changes a lot. Again, I'm not going to go blow for blow, but just off the top of things, I mentioned the change in name to Ballister. In the book, it's Blackheart. In the movie, it's Boldheart. That goes with actually an almost complete character overhaul. Ballister in the film is basically a wronged man. He is finding himself stuck with the label of villain and having to work outside the law by necessity because he's been framed. There's no framing of Ballister in the novel. He's a villain, and he knows that. He owns that. He still has rules. He still has things that he's not comfortable doing, and that does cause conflict with Nimona sometimes. But at the start of this, he's just a bad guy. He knows that. Everybody knows that. The movie, he's trying very hard not to be.
If you see anyone, murder them. Hide. If you see anyone, hide.
But he's still finding himself in that role, in that position. And the name change kind of reflects that. He's not black-hearted. This isn't who he is. He's a very bold and noble person in a bad situation. Which is not to say that Ballister in the book doesn't have some more depth to him. He absolutely does. But it's presented to the audience kind of the inverse in each case. In the book, we're presented with a bad guy, and then we get some more layers to him as we go. In the film, we're presented with a good guy who comes to learn that sometimes you gotta break stuff.
Let's break stuff.
The relationship between Ambrosius and Ballister, which is hinted at in the graphic novel, is made explicit in the movie. And also going along with the framing of Ballister, Ambrosius did cost Ballister his arm, but it was in a moment of panic and a confused situation. So it was not a deliberate choice that was made. Although, to his recollection in the heat of the moment, that was kind of how it felt in the graphic novel, though how much of it that was the reality. But there's Nimona, the shapeshifter. She goes harder. That is true in both cases. There's no slaughtered king. There's no mystery. There's no twist villain in the graphic novel. In the movie, we have the director framed Ballister in an effort to keep a commoner from ascending to a point of power that she feels is profane. We have this backstory of this historical figure of Glorith, which gets a reference in the book, but is a very minor point. It is a major point in the movie. And in terms of the climax and the destruction wrought by Nimona, that happens in both cases. The nature of it is quite different. It is more chaotic in the graphic novel. It's hard to even explain. Basically, Nimona's kind of been split into two parts. But so much of what's in the movie just flat out isn't in the book. There's no squire that they interrogate. There's lots of individual beats that are referenced or homaged or do occur, like her transforming into a shark during the moment when she's getting him to agree to take her on as a sidekick. The Monopoly game, that's pretty much straight lifted. The fact that she becomes a young boy for a short time, that's in both places, although the nature of why that happens and how those scenes play out, very different.
I hate to say it, but you make a pretty good bad guy.
There are characters in the graphic novel that do not appear in the movie. There are characters in the movie that do not appear in the graphic novel. There's no Todd in the graphic novel.
Bruh.
So the movie's quite different. The story is different. The plot progression is different. The climax has a similar flavor, but is fairly different. The ending note is a bit different.
Holy!
So how am I saying that this is a masterful adaptation if so much was changed? Because it was changed with purpose, and it was changed smartly. Let's start with kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room on this. The emphasis and the bringing forward far more explicitly of the queer themes.
You want me to shift? You don't want me to shift? Pick a lane!
And now you're a boy.
I am today.
Now, to be clear, this book, lots of queer themes in here. As I said, Stevenson was working through, or at least starting to work through, a lot of his own sense of gender and trying to get a handle on himself while working on this. So those themes are very much present. They are injected into it, but not necessarily on purpose. What I mean by that is when the book was being written, or when it was still a webcomic, I suppose, Stevenson didn't know what these things that he was exploring and working through meant. The themes were there, but they were there in a, they have to be put somewhere and they're going to end up here way. He didn't fully know where his life was going. He didn't fully know how much these themes, these notions of queerness, of change, of altering yourself to be more accepted, he didn't know what these things meant, the fact that he was exploring them. They were there, but if you've ever known someone who is queer and is creative and has had to go through a period of coming to a greater acceptance of themselves, I've gone through this where you look back at your own creative work, in my case, my own writing, and realized how much queerness was injected into it from the get-go. It's there. I just didn't know it. Kind of the same thing. But what that means is, because the movie is made after that has been completed, and after Stevenson has come to a full realization of himself and has started to live his truth, that means that the movie can have the awareness of the themes that just arose organically within the book. So whereas the book had these themes in there as the creator was working through them, the movie can go, this has those queer themes. Rather than just having them be sprinkled throughout, let's lean into them and really do them. And let's do them on purpose, and let's do them big, and let's have that be the point.
The shape shifting. I mean, does it hurt or does it... Sorry, small-minded question.
I feel worse when I don't do it. Like my insides are itchy. Then I shapeshift, and I'm free.
What if you held it in?
I'd die.
Good Lord, that's horrible.
I wouldn't die, I just
Sure wouldn't be living.
It's a really unique approach to take a theme that is undoubtedly present, but is a little bit more subdued, but wasn't necessarily subdued by choice, because Stevenson didn't know how much this was going to matter. And I'm not going to go so far as to claim Stevenson would have made the queer theming much more upfront and present in the graphic novel if he'd realized where his life was going. He might or he might not have. I will note that he was consulted fairly regularly in the production of this movie. So that to me indicates at the very least he seems to think that this approach makes sense. To take the themes that were just there and arose from the nature of what the creator was going through, front and center. Let's really drill into these. Let's integrate them across the whole story, make it the point.
It'd be easier if you were a girl.
Easier to be a girl? You're hilarious.
I mean, easier if you looked human.
Easier for who?
There are some who might say that is lacking the subtlety of the original. I would argue the original wasn't meant to be a subtle queer story. It ended up being one because of what the creator was going through in his life. It is one on a subtle level, but it doesn't need to be. That wasn't necessarily a creative choice. That's just what happened. So that's the first thing. Let's talk Ballister. So Ballister, as I said, has gone through a fairly significant change. He's largely just been softened. Rather than being someone who has embraced villainy outright, he is someone who is struggling with the label of villain and actually has to come to terms with the idea that the Institute is fundamentally broken and needs to be taken down.
What's it all really for?
For protecting the realm.
Oh, you mean from villains like you? Or monsters? Like me?
The reason this is a smart change is severalfold. The first thing is, this helps play into the decision to do the queer themes front and center so much more than they were originally. Because to have someone who was part of a system come to realize that the system is broken and corrupt, that's not instantaneous. To have someone who was privileged and is now being looked down on by this system, that can take some time. He has to go through the learning process of, no, it's not one bad person at the head of this. The fundamental system is broken and is failing the people. It has failed you. It has failed Nimona. It should not be allowed to continue. He has to go through a journey to realize that. And that gives multiple queer perspectives to the movie. Because you have Nimona, who knows full well that everything is messed up and needs to be taken apart. And you have Ballister, who recognized something is wrong, but needs to go through the journey to realize just how far that goes, which is reflective of many queer people who grow up with a certain amount of privilege. Hi. It enables it to not only go deeper into queer themes, but to have more than one queer perspective on everything going on. Another reason why I think it was very smart to soften him is they also had to soften Nimona a bit, and they then had to kind of soften him by association. What do I mean by they softened Nimona? Well, Nimona kills people in the graphic novel, like from a very early point. And that's actually a point of conflict between Ballister and Nimona, because he has to keep trying to tell her, please stop doing that. That's not how I like to operate. I don't want to do that, and I don't want you to. She's very relaxed with killing people. They kind of keep that in the movie insofar as she suggests that they kill people quite readily, and she seems prepared to do it, but she never does.
Then let's go get him. Let's go get him.
In the book, she absolutely does. And if you're going to soften her, you then kind of need to also soften Ballister, because it is key to the dynamic that she goes harder than he does. So if you're making her softer, and if you then kept Ballister about the same as he was in the graphic novel, then the difference isn't there as much. Because graphic novel, like, he's here, she's up here. And that gap needs to be about the same size. So if you bring her down to about here, where she's not so uncontrollable in her intention and desire to kill people, well, the dynamic, the gap is now smaller. So we got to soften him now too. So interestingly, though there is a fairly significant alteration to the specifics of the character of Ballister, that was kind of done in service of preserving the dynamic out of softening Nimona. Now, you can make your arguments about should they have softened Nimona. This is ultimately an animated film aimed at a younger audience. Yeah, I think that was probably a good idea to not have her just go about casually killing people. I mean, if Netflix wanted to fund an R-rated cut of this to have them go back and just have her killing people left and right, I'd be willing to watch it, but it's not necessary. And that's not me saying it was a flaw in the book, but the webcomic, given the nature of who webcomics appeal to, especially back when Stevenson was writing this thing, that sort of level of violence in a stylized fantasy world, that could be aimed at an audience that is basically going to be okay with that level of violence. Whereas the movie was honestly kind of targeted at a more specific audience. I'm not going to say that an audience in the age range that the movie could appeal to should not read this. I'm not going to say that, honestly, at all. My kid has read this and seen the movie and loves them both. But what I am going to say is that this was not specifically targeted at a youth audience. It is accessible to a youth audience. And I think a lot of youth audience really dig the hell out of it, but it wasn't targeted at that. Whereas the movie was targeted at that audience and made what I think are some appropriate adjustments to go along with it. The whole thing of bringing in a twist with the director, that also serves a pretty interesting purpose, because this goes along with the softening of Ballister, because he has to hold, at least initially, some belief that the Institute isn't completely rotten so that he can have a bit more of an arc. But that gives us a situation where we have the death of the Queen, and now we need someone who caused this to happen. That gives us the director. The director is in a graphic novel. She's a bit more just ruthless scientific progress type. She wants to capture Nimona, study Nimona, make weapons based off Nimona, whereas the director in the movie just wants to destroy her. Again, I think this change works really, really well because what they do leans much more into the queer theming that they are overall leaning into much more heavily across the board in the movie. And it also gives her a reason to go into a very different set of motives. In the movie being effectively just rooted in reactionary beliefs.
Ever since I was young, I've had the same nightmare. I find a crack in the wall, and the crack grows bigger and bigger until the wall crumbles. Allowing Ballister to hold the sword was the first crack in the wall.
The idea that things should never change. Things have been this way and they must always be this way, and the degree to which she is prepared to go in order to accomplish that.
I begged the Queen not to question the word of Glorith. Not to question what's kept us safe for 1,000 years. I gave the order.
But firing them will take out half the city. Innocent people will die.
And so will the monster.
And that is the appropriate villain if you're going to center the queerness so much more bluntly than the book did.
Can't you see this is what it wants? For us to let our guard down?
There's the climax, and both deal with a version of Nimona being massive and dangerous and angry. The movie leans much more into the tragedy and the sadness of that, with the expanded backstory with Glorith. Smartly, neither one truly gives us a proper origin for her. Both offer, well, maybe it's this, but both also undercut what they offer. In the movie, there's the wishing well. In the book, there's a backstory with a witch. Both of which are pretty much definitively disproven, or at least given sufficient reason to not think that that is what happened. So that means that in both cases, Nimona's old, very old. So far as we can tell, she has always been around. And she's been through a lot. And you understand in both cases where her anger comes from. I said Nimona was softened a little bit. really only in terms of the fact that she doesn't kill people. Pretty much the rest of what she is, how she behaves, how she reacts, it's pretty exact. So the titular character is preserved very, very closely. The climax in the movie and the subsequent ending is a bit more uplifting. The book goes for something a bit more melancholy. Not devoid of hope, but Nimona's gone at the end. And I don't mean dead. There's indications she isn't, but she has left. And Ballister is just left to wonder anytime he sees a certain look from a stranger on the street, or if a cat stops and looks at him for longer than he feels it would normally, he has to wonder, is that her? And if it is, I hope she knows I'm her friend. It's a more melancholy note. But again, with the shift onto the queer themes, I think the need for a more cleanly triumphant ending, and like, it's sad for a bit, yes, but to get that burst of joyful hope at the very end of the movie,
Holy!
yeah, that should be there. The ending of the climax and the apparent death of Nimona, which happens in both cases, the specifics differ. In the movie, that makes me cry. The book, it never did, but that's not to say that it isn't still powerful in the book, just that it's not deliberately going for the heartstrings in the same way, but that element of tragedy, of look at what she is because the world won't let her be anything else. That's there in both cases. Ultimately, what this comes down to is that the heart, the soul of this book, the queerness, the anger, the loneliness, the need to fight and tear at the system that says you're a monster and wants to either destroy you or use you for its own ends. All of that is taken from the book, given some shifts, given some alterations, but it does all these changes, and it's many changes. Injecting new material, removing whole swaths of stuff, changing most of it, but the central character, the heart of the story, both the character heart of the story and the thematic heart of the story, not only preserved, but in the case of the theming, the queer theming, enhanced. And when you can take the core theme of a piece of work that part of the charm of it is being a little rough around the edges, and focus that, sharpen it, then speaking personally at least, I don't care what specific details you changed. You took what that original work was saying and you put it on screen, loud and proud. That, to me, is the key of any adaptation. If you truly believe in the original work, and it's not just like, oh, that's a nifty idea, we could do that. If you truly believe in the value of the original work, the thing to preserve is the heart of it. The details can change. That's fine. You can change backstories. You can change plot progression. You can change names. Keep the heart. Keep the soul. Nimona does that amazingly. If you have seen the movie and not read the book, read the book. If you read the book and not seen the movie, see the movie. If you have seen the movie and read the book, do that back to back. Read the book, rewatch the movie. Let it sink in. How different and yet how perfectly the same they are. Doing an adaptation that varies this much, that still feels exactly like what it should be, is a rare treat in adaptation. And it's one more reason for me to absolutely adore the movie. But more than that, if you find the kinds of changes made in the adaptation process to just be an interesting thing, which I do. I talk about it every now and then when I find an excuse. If the kinds of adaptational choices that have to be made fascinate you, this is a masterclass in, by most measures, drastic changes, but still unmistakably being the same story. Nimona, masterclass in adaptation. An adaptation that does not need to be slavish to the original, but still gets it right. What do you think about all this? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills, enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe. They all help me out, but don't worry too much about it. What I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful. You are valid. You are loved. You are not a monster. You're the council and I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Shout out to the patrons who helped make this possible. In particular, I want to thank Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfola, Goddess Elida, Tarak, the thing that goes joint in the anime, Ruth, Oliver B., Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Pranabilax the Poodle, Robin Powell, T. Love, Tracy Scrappett, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, and Rosalind Bennett. There's being able to hear me try and pronounce your name, plus a whole bunch of other rewards on the Patreon. You can check out the tiers, but if you're already on the list, thank you so much.